Welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast, the resource for transitional and experienced genealogists who want to create a successful business. I'm your host, Miriam Pierre-Louis. Here you'll learn from professionals all around the world who work in the field of genealogy. Are you ready to get started? Then let's get going. This podcast is sponsored in part by the Association of Professional Genealogists. You can find out more about them at www.apgen.org. Welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast. Today we head over to England to get to know house historian Melanie Backe Hansen. Melanie, welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast.
Thank you.
Let's get started by having you tell us about yourself and give us an overview of your genealogy business. Well, actually, I should say your house history business.
That's right. I am a house historian. So it does closely resemble sort of genealogy, but I focus more on houses. So I look at the stories of the history of a house from before it was built and looking at what was on the location before the house was built, and then following the story through to when the house was built, who were the first people to live there, and then all the stories sort of attached to owners or occupiers throughout its history, and telling the story of a house through the people that have lived there. So, yeah, that's essentially my my life, which is brilliant.
Tell us about how you came to be a house historian. Did you do something else before? How did you end up in this kind of unusual profession?
Yeah, I did. I studied history at university, so I'm a sort of traditional historian from that background, but didn't want to initially be an academic in that sense. So I went into publishing as my first career. And so for many years, I actually worked in marketing and PR for an educational publisher. And through a very sort of roundabout story, I was looking for a new opportunity, and I found, at the time I actually didn't know who it was, but it was a company who were looking for someone who could do historic research, but also had a bit of marketing and PR background in order to write and speak about the history. And it was only at my second interview that I discovered it was for an estate agent. So, which was quite interesting, and it had never been done before. Certainly in the UK, I'm the only person who's been employed by an estate agent to research the history of houses. So I started doing that in 2006, and I spent many happy years sort of going across the UK researching different houses, from townhouses in the centre of London to, country cottages and sort of manor houses and all sorts of different properties in order to promote them for the estate agent. So that's how I sort of came to find this role. So it was very unique and still is.
I think it's really unusual that an estate agent, I'll just translate that for all of the Americans, that's a real estate office.
Right, yes.
That they had the forethought or the out-of-the-box thinking to hire somebody like you. When you were working for them, how did they select the houses that you would research?
That's a very good question, because in essence, you could do a house history for any house. So you could have a small, 2 up, 2 down, as we call them, or a small house through to, a large stately home, and you could do the house history and tell the story of that house. But in the estate agent or the real estate company I worked for, it was a mixture between houses that were already known to have some element of history. So they may have had some old sort of timber frame structure, or it was a listed property, or there was perhaps already a story attached to it from a famous resident or something along those lines. So I would come in and sort of put together the story in order to either gain extra publicity for the house or produce it for some of the marketing material. But I was also brought in sometimes to research a house which perhaps was having difficulty in being sold, and I was brought in to sort of add a different dimension to the promotion of the property, so to raise awareness of it, to gain a bit of interest in it purely based on its history.
Did you ever bring up the subject of ghost stories, maybe not actual ghost stories, but, you know, when you're doing house history research, sometimes houses have reputations for having ghosts. Did that ever come up? And if so, how did you handle it with your publicity? Did you celebrate those stories or did you just kind of ignore them?
Well, it's interesting, actually, because that does often, it's either that or murders, which are the first things that people bring up. And, you know, are there any sort of dramatic murder stories or ghosts? But actually, in all honesty, I found very few of those kinds of stories. There was one house, there was a couple of houses which sort of had tenuous links to supposed ghost stories. One in particular, which actually didn't end up being seen through to sale, so I didn't end up writing the full history of it. But that was actually something that the current vendor or the owner had told us. So he thought it was a fascinating story, and the usual sort of guide was if it was long enough in the past, or the association perhaps the ghostly story hadn't sort of revealed itself recently, then it would be more interesting. And the same with murder stories. If it's far enough in the past, most people will start to find it interesting as opposed to scary or off-putting. So I wasn't sort of put in that position that I had to choose whether to say something or not. There was one particular house, actually, which in the end we didn't mention anything about this particular story, and that was that the current owners had heard a story, so it was sort of, you know, Chinese whispers a little bit, but they'd heard a story that when the house was being renovated in the sort of 1950s, that they'd pulled away sort of partitions and were restoring it back to its original form, so tearing away different walls and screens and things. And they found a priest hole, which I don't know if your audience know, but priest holes were often found in older houses from about 16th or 17th century when it was not really, well, it was illegal. It was sort of against general practice to be a Catholic. So if a family were Catholic, they often had these sort of holes or hideaways for their Catholic material or for an actual priest to hide away in. And this particular house, there was a priest hole, but the story goes that the priest was still in it. So there was literally a skeleton with robes on, and it was still in the house.
Wow.
So that was one very dramatic story, which we were able to talk about afterwards, but not at the time that we were promoting the house.
So the skeleton's still there to this day?
No, they took it out.
Oh, wow.
But that was...
Wow, that's pretty dramatic.
That was quite a story.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome, though. A little scary when you think of the priest, but...
I know,
oh, boy.
Yeah.
So this estate agent, I'm assuming is a fairly high-end estate agent. The properties are pretty luxurious, expensive anyways. Yeah,
it's most of the properties I researched had sort of quite expensive value, but they weren't the most expensive houses. It's worth saying they weren't the large sort of Downton Abbey stately home types. They were sort of, you know, normal residential houses. But yeah, the estate agent did deal with sort of high-end property mostly, yeah.
So how long were you in that position before you realized, wow, I just really love my job?
Well, I loved it from the beginning. I've always, as soon as I sort of discovered that I had this job, it was perfect. So actually, ever since the beginning, I loved it. But I was there for 6 years in all, so it was quite a long time. And it was in the last sort of year or two, I had written my first book, and I was also being asked to do more and more private commissions. So it was sort of towards that end period that I suddenly thought, wait, hang on, I could do this on my own and make a business out of it.
Now, before we head off in that direction, tell me, as you're working as a house historian in this role, what did you do for professional development? How did you learn the tricks of the trade? Or did you just get it from experience and not actually go for any professional training? It
was a little bit of both. There wasn't, certainly when I studied history at university, there was no course in this specifically. So when I first started, it was a lot of self-teaching. I got a lot of books. There's a couple of books that are very specific to the UK housing or history market. There's one particularly one on researching houses in London, and then there's another one which is a general researching houses across the UK. So I got both of those books, and sort of a lot of it was self-taught. And then with the experience of actually being sent off to research particular properties in all parts of the country, I was then able to learn from experience and work things out as I went. So yeah.
Do you think at that time you were doing that there was anybody else in the UK who was traveling across such a broad geographic area? You know, house historians usually stick to one area.
Yeah, as I went, I did actually do a couple of classes, and I did sort of find out about a few particular people that were doing a similar thing to me. But literally, I could count them on one hand for those people who actually were researching houses across the country. But on the other hand, they also did other things. So they probably diversified into family history and other elements of research. But there certainly were very few people that were researching houses across such a broad spectrum.
So when you were in London, you know, did you have a network of people that you could, you know, meet for coffee or meet for a pint and talk about the challenges of being a house historian?
No, not at that point. I was very much doing it on my own and didn't really. But after a while, I did meet a few more, and actually now there is a group of people. There's a handful of people I know and I'm good friends with, and there's a couple of other girls actually that they all do house histories in a slightly different way. So we don't feel like we're competing as such, but we all do. We essentially research houses, and we have our own sort of unofficial little gang of house historians.
Tell us about that transition when you realized that you could go on your own. What was going through your head at that time? Did you do any business plan? Did you look at the numbers, or did you just throw caution to the wind, said, I'm going to go do this, and you set up shop?
Yeah, it was more the latter. I don't know, I'm not very business-minded in that sense, and I'm not very entrepreneurial by nature, and I've got some very good friends who are, so they're very good for advice. But I think because I was getting, fortunately, enough requests for work that I suddenly thought, okay, I could just go and do this. But as you say, I didn't do any numbers. I didn't sit down and do a full plan. It was just a case of working through the contacts I had, and I guess I was fortunate because I'd already built up a reputation in the work that I'd done for the estate agent. So I had a few contacts in the media and property journalists and people like that, as well as the use of Twitter actually was enormously useful. So I hooked up with a lot of other heritage professionals, not necessarily, you know, house historians or property historians, but people who obviously had a passion for history and were somehow related. And through some of those networks, then word of mouth and talking to people, it got to that point that I could step out, you know. So yeah, I just went for it.
How did you handle all the business stuff that you have to know or take care of when you're self-employed like that? Did you learn how to take care of all these different things yourself, or did you hire people to help you, you know, with accounting and marketing and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I had done snippets of it because I'd sort of registered as a self-employed person prior to leaving the estate agent. So you could do that where, because I was offering a service and I was charging people for a service, I had to register as self-employed for Inland Revenue. So I'd already done some of that before I stepped out on my own. And I had an awareness of how to, you know, produce invoices and all that sort of thing. It wasn't a very formal structure, but as it was just me and I was just doing small snippets, and I worked that out on my own. Since then, I have definitely got an accountant, and I've actually recently found an accountant who actually have special departments for sort of more unique self-employed people. So namely writers and journalists and people like that who have not your normal work structure. So they've been really useful, and it's great to be able to sort of rely on someone to do the big things like the tax at the end of the year. So, but a lot of it was just reading through information on being self-employed and just gaining a personal understanding of how this works and what I need to do to operate.
Can you share with us a challenge or an obstacle that you experienced after you went out on your own? Maybe something didn't go quite as planned, and then tell us about how you worked around it.
Probably the biggest challenge I had is actually working out sort of fees and structure, because it's such a sort of unique area, and there's no real benchmark. There's no organisation of house historians to sort of go to work out what's a sort of standard fee, and there was a lot of that I had to sort of work out. And in some ways I look back and think, I probably undercharged for things like that, but I've sort of worked that out through a process of elimination and working out what different clients will pay, and it is tricky. I still find it tricky in some ways because it is unique, and so in some ways you're only as valuable as what people will pay. So it's, you have to sort of work that out as you deal with different types of people. That's probably the biggest challenge I had. I had one client which sort of was through an intermediary, and that caused a challenge because the intermediary didn't perhaps operate as he should have, and so there were some difficulties in getting paid and things like that. But fortunately, I saw it through, and I had the advice of a legal friend. But that's probably the biggest sort of scary challenge I had, when I was in danger of not being paid for work that I'd done. But fortunately, that all worked out in the end.
Where do you put your focus for your projects? Are you talking to private homeowners? Are you talking to estate agents? Are you talking to organizations? What type of person is going to contact you and ask for a house history?
Well, it's a mixture of all those, actually. I'm really fortunate, I think, because I had that background with a property company or a real estate company. I'm known to some level in that world. So I still do sort of consulting for a range of different estate agents and property companies in London mainly. And so I do little snippets of house histories for high-profile estate agents. But then probably the bulk of my work is for private individuals, and it's those people who, all sorts of different reasons, maybe they've just spent the last few years renovating a house, and this is sort of the icing on the cake of we've created our ideal family home. And then I go and research the history of the house, and it's presented as a book, and it's a nice final cherry on top. But then I've also done houses which were family homes for many years, and this was a sort of gift from other family members as a remembrance or a memory of their time in the house. There's all sorts of different reasons why people will do it. So, but it's most of my work is private individuals who ask me to research the history, and then that's sort of written up as a sort of mini book and a story of the house, and then it's bound into a book, and they have that keepsake. But then I still write my own sort of books on the side. I write articles. I do talks to different organizations. I've done some consulting for different corporations who where the history of houses or the history of how we have lived is sort of instrumental in how they promote their business. So it's really a real mix of all those different elements.
Is your writing and public speaking the best way to promote yourself? So that for new business?
Yeah, I have found the writing is great. So, say for example, one of my biggest clients where I'm still working on is quite a large project, which is the history of not only a house, but it's an area of land, it's a property. They own a number of streets, and there's a whole big project attached to that. But he actually found me through an article I'd written for a local magazine. And then some clients have found me through Twitter. I've done some blogging, and a lot of the time it's those little snippets where people will see, oh, there's someone who researches houses, how interesting, and then they'll get in touch. So, and then some people have known me through my books, and they've heard about me through a talk, or they've heard me talk. So, but it's mainly the writing, I'd say. But I am doing more and more talks, actually. The next couple of weeks, I'm doing 2 talks that I have to prepare for. So it's all those things put together, really.
What about media, television, radio appearances? Tell us about how often you're doing those kind of appearances to talk about house histories.
It's funny, actually. They come in waves, which is I've never quite worked out. But I do snippets. Either because I've been talking about a particular project for a client, and they've engaged or sort of arranged for different interviews to take place. But then I do get calls, to comment. Just recently, I commented on the history of semi-detached houses in the Times newspaper. But I will get a call from different people because they're doing a story on something that's newsworthy, and I'll jump on the radio and do that. But it does sort of go in odd waves, and so I'll have nothing for a few months, and then all of a sudden I'll have, a few calls in a couple of weeks. So, but that's great, actually, because I find it really, it's interesting to get it out there. I know, a lot of, there's a sort of obsession, certainly with UK, and I'm sure it's the same in other countries in the United States, that this obsession with our own homes, it's everything from DIY to knowing the history of our house to, buying your first house to your ancestral home. And there's such a personal attachment to our houses that it's really nice to get out there in the media and actually talk about it, and it sort of brings people's interests alive. So, yeah, it's good.
Is there anything on TV right now that might touch on house histories? I know that in the UK you have Who Do You Think You Are? Would they ever touch on house history, or are there any other programs that are historical that might go into that?
Yeah, there are. I've actually been called by a number of different production companies who have ideas for doing something like Who Do You Think You Are, but for houses. Nothing's quite got off the ground yet, but it's certainly an interest to people. There have been some programs here, which things like something called Restoration Home, which involved restoring an old property, and they also, alongside that, they had an architectural historian or an architect to go in and tell the story of the architectural structure and the different elements of the actual built structure. And then they also had a historian to come in and tell some of the stories attached to the house. And that also, there's another program called Restoration Man, which was a particular presenter called George Clark, who, again, he sort of went to people who were restoring a historic property. Most often it was an unusual property, so it might have been an old windmill or an old warehouse or something. So it wasn't a traditional residential home. But he would still include elements of the history alongside that. So there have been a few programs like that where they bring in a bit of the history. But as yet, there's nothing that's solely about it. There's nothing quite, not like Who Do You Think You Are, which is obviously all about genealogy. We haven't quite reached the point of having that for houses yet.
You've mentioned that you have a couple friends that kind of do the same thing that you do.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what group you kind of self-identify with. Here in the United States, as house historians, there's no kind of house historian group or community, but many house historians either self-identify with genealogists or with architectural historians. Do you just kind of keep off to yourself with this small group of people, or do you actually go to conferences, larger conferences, by these more organized traditions, either genealogists or architectural historians?
Yeah, it's a real mix, actually. And I think, as you said, it is very much the same. There's no real one house historians or building historians group. And it tends to be a bit of a divide. And there are most of the people I know either came to house history through architectural history. And so they personally will probably put themselves in that group. But then others who've come to it through genealogy, and then again, they'll put themselves in the sort of family history or genealogy group. I know some people who've come to it from archaeology as well, or town planning and that sort of side of things. I guess because at heart, I'm a social historian, so I'm a little bit torn between all those elements. I don't really fit into a box of any of those. So there's not really one group, I do tend to keep my ear open for different things, and I will go along to a conference, or I will, go along to a talk that's about a particular type of architecture or something, to sort of keep in the loop. But there's not one organisation as such as sort of that we all belong to. So it is a bit tricky. Maybe that's something for the future.
Do you ever work with on a particular project with people of other disciplines? So you may have maybe a large project and you're working with archaeologists, you're working with historical contractors, maybe you're working with people who are specialists in historical paints. Do you ever get in a situation like that where you get to work with a whole group of people?
I haven't yet, actually. I know it does happen, and I have been called in to sort of potentially be involved with projects like that, but they haven't quite happened. And it really varies. So whether it was, I guess because I look at houses from a historic point of view rather than architectural, then someone might bring in a purely architectural person and then bring me in as a purely historical person. But there are elements of people who, they're paint experts, or they're interior experts, or they're furniture experts. And so it depends on the project. I haven't yet been involved with anything like that, but it does happen. But so maybe in the future again it will.
Genealogists spend a lot of time, whether they know it or not, or whether they like it or not, volunteering or doing pro bono work. Does that happen to you at all, or do you stay pretty focused just on work?
Yes, it does. I think it also happens, I think, for sort of journalists and writers, where, especially in this sort of digital age, a number of occasions it happens where someone will ask you to write a column or write a blog, and they don't have a budget to pay you. And that also happens for talks. I quite often get called in for organisations which are charities, and they don't have a budget to pay you. They might pay your expenses, or they will allow you to promote your book or promote yourself, for your business, but they don't offer a fee. So that does happen. It's sort of, I guess I'm really fortunate because I have a good amount of paid work, put it that way. So I can squeeze in these kind of jobs where it's more about promoting yourself. But there are occasions where you have to perhaps turn them down and say, well, I actually don't have time to do that unless you're willing to pay me. But it definitely does happen, yeah.
What's the most fun project you've ever worked on that you can share with us?
Oh, that's a tough one. That is really tough. I genuinely love all the projects I've done, and I'd say that with true honesty, because it's so much about the history, and it doesn't matter what kind of house you're doing. I love unraveling the stories and finding the hidden secrets behind different people or some dramas that have happened in a house. I did have one recently which I loved because it had such a close connection with the current owner, and that was it was basically the house had been owned by the same people for about 30 or 40 years. And the head of the house was an actor, so he's quite well known, but it was actually a surprise for his birthday, so that it was his wife who commissioned me to do it. But delving into the story, I found some fantastic stories about writers and different people who were connected or lived in the house, some aristocrats and some people who owned loads of land out in the country. But the best thing was in the middle of the 19th century, so it was about the 1860s, I think, it was actually occupied by another actor. So it was a well-known sort of Victorian stage actor, and he was prominent on the stage throughout that period. But what was even better is he actually held acting lessons in the house. And I found newspaper advertisements promoting, come to the house to be taught by a renowned actor. You'll be taught in all things calisthenics, fencing, French, and all these sorts of different things, which of course actors probably don't do now, but for the stage, that was what you did. But it was fantastic, this little snippet of the history of the house that had such a close connection with the current owners. So I loved that, and they actually only were in the house for a few years. And as it turns out, that actor's daughter also became a famous actress, and she travelled not only in the UK, but she travelled to Australia and the United States and was quite a prominent actress at the time. So all those sort of little gems that you find that have such a close association with the current owners that just bring a house alive. It was brilliant.
Wonderful. Now, you've got 2 published books. Why don't you go ahead and tell us the titles of those books and what's the different focus of each book?
Yes, my first book is called House Histories. The subtitle is The Secrets Behind Your Front Door. And that's a collection of stories of different houses. So there's almost 100 different houses across the UK. And they're big houses, small houses, some famous, some not famous. A real collection of different stories. And it's very much looking behind what we'd perhaps call ordinary houses and uncovering these amazing stories. Some that were home to actors and actresses and artists, but also, uncovering completely surprising stories. So that's close to my heart because it's all about unraveling the stories behind ordinary houses. And then the second book, which came out late last year, is called Historic Streets and Squares. And that's, again, it's across the UK, and it's stories of different streets and squares. So it's famous streets like Portobello Road or Soho Square in London. But then there's some sort of, most of them are well known, but and if you look at the pictures, a lot of international people will probably recognise them too. But they're a mixture of old medieval streets. There's one called the Shambles in York, and then some little quaint little, picture postcard type streets. But then also the grand developed squares that there were a number in London, but also across the UK. So there's some in Bristol, and there's some in Scotland, and some in Manchester and Birmingham, and different parts of the country. And it's telling the stories of how they came about, how they became these sort of, these key locations across the country. And that's, again, it's about unraveling and looking beyond the facade. And the sort of streets that people would walk down and perhaps not think twice about, or look up and think, oh, that's interesting, I wonder why that's there. And it's telling the stories of those different locations.
Cool. And those are available on Amazon.com, even in the U.S. You can pick those up.
Yes.
Because I just checked.
Yes, you can.
Let's take a quick break to hear a message from the Association of Professional Genealogists.
Hi, I'm Darcy Hind-Pose, APG Board Member, Awards Committee Chair, and member of the Youth Committee. Do you know a student and/or young professional who aspires to a career in genealogy? The Association of Professional Genealogists invites applications for its Young Professional Scholarship, which gives free registration and reimburses the winner for up to $1,000 for travel and lodging costs incurred when attending APG's annual Professional Management Conference. The deadline for submissions is July 22nd, and more information is available at www.apgen.org. The winner will be announced in August 2014. The future of genealogy depends upon fostering relationships among genealogists at all levels and supporting young professionals who bring fresh perspective to our field.
All right, we are going to pick up the pace now as we enter the lightning round. I'm going to toss a whole bunch of questions at you. Are you ready?
Okay, I think so.
All right. What was the one thing you're most afraid of in starting your own business?
I think getting clients that worry about where would work come from.
What is the best advice you've ever received?
I think it's just go for it. Give it a go. Just, if you think you've got the backing, just do it.
What is one specific action listeners can take in the next 24 hours to help them transition into a house history or genealogy career?
Ooh, I would say research. Look at, read about what other people have done, get a few books, read what other people do. That's probably research.
Mm-hmm. What is your preferred social media channel?
Twitter, definitely. I'm a bit of a, I'm on Twitter a lot, probably too much.
And you're at House Historian, right, on Twitter?
That's right, yes. Yeah.
Lucky. If you can recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be?
Oh, well, is it cheeky to say my own book?
Well, no, say a different book, because I'm going to include your books in the show notes anyways. So let's do, it could be a business book. It doesn't even have to be a house history book.
Well, no, I think probably the most useful, actually, if you're genuinely looking into house histories, is a book by Nick Barrett, and I can't remember the exact title, but it's a very in-depth look at all the elements of researching a house in
Is
the
it
UK.
Tracing the History of Your House?
That sounds like it, yes. Yeah, Nick Barrett's probably known to many of you for his family history, genealogy work, but he does do house history as well.
I actually have that book, and I bought it, and I looked at it, and then I go, oh my God, things are so different over there. And that was pretty much the last time I looked at it.
It is, it's quite comprehensive. He does sort of go into detail, which is why I like it, because it sort of goes into all the ins and outs of it. But yeah.
All right, we'll do a little tips from the pros, with you being the pro. If somebody wanted to become a house historian and say totally from scratch, they're a beginner, it's just an idea, what are 3 quick tips that you can give them to send them on their way? What should they do?
That is tricky. I guess, well, it's understand the craft and, get a knowledge of how to research houses. And, that is different in different areas. So to gain an understanding of how that works and become an expert in that. Probably, if you are new to it and you're trying to get your name out there, then joining organizations and networking is important. And I think because my background is PR and marketing, I was a bit of a networker before, but that's actually invaluable in linking up with other heritage professionals and other people in the business, and you can gain advice and also just have that connection with other people. Third, I guess it's just get out there and start. I mean, probably genealogy or house histories, a lot of it is work in progress. You're always learning as you're going. So even now, I'll be learning until I pass away. You're always learning about different elements. So it's just get into it and start researching, learning about the areas that you want to become an expert in.
Give our audience one parting piece of advice, and then tell us how we can get in contact with you.
Probably the best bit of advice is don't always believe what you read on the internet. That's golden rule. It can be enormously useful, and there's obviously a lot of subscription-based search places where you can find documents and all sorts, but a lot of information may not be true. So the historian in me is saying, always research, check your information. Don't always take one person's word for it. So back things up, look at different sources. That's probably, the best thing. And if people want to get in touch with me, my website is www.house-historian.co.uk. And, on Twitter again, I'm @househistorian. And, that's probably the best place to go.
Melanie Backe Hansen, thank you so much for coming on the Genealogy Professional Podcast today.
No, thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, we learned so many interesting things from Melanie Backe Hansen today. It was really interesting to hear how she got started as the only house historian employed by a real estate company in the United Kingdom, and how she then turned that into a jumping off point for her own house history business. We learned about her challenge in figuring out how to set fees when she started her business, and we learned about her fear of not getting paid. And these are certainly issues that all of us have to deal with. We also heard about some pretty fun stories, such as the story about the priest hole and the priest still being in it, and also the story where her most favorite project was the house where the actor lived, and she was able to discover that an actor had lived there previously. And I know, certainly for myself, that's one of the funnest things about doing house history research. It's kind of, the same thing as doing genealogy. It's that discovery of the past and making those connections that is so much fun. And Melanie also has issues with volunteering, and it was interesting to hear from her that many of the issues she has to deal with relate to writing and people wanting her to write for free. And certainly we all volunteer in different ways, and we all have to figure out a way to balance that. Before I let you go this week, we do need to do an action item. And I want to focus on kind of a combination of a bunch of things that Melanie had said. She talked about appearing on different TV shows such as Restoration Home and Restoration Man. And these shows weren't specifically house history shows, but her expertise contributed to the story of the show. So she fit into the show anyways, even though the show wasn't focused on her topic specifically. And she also talked about networking with heritage professionals and different types of heritage professionals, not just house historians, in order to create opportunities for herself. And you can transfer this same thought process to your business as a genealogy professional. Don't get hung up on the fact that Melanie's a house historian. Think about how she was able to take these other areas, these other interests that were related to her field but different, and she was able to add value to those. So I want you to think about, are there other organizations outside of genealogy but that are related to your niche that you could partner with? So if you specialize in a geographic area, then you'd want to focus on heritage and historic organizations in your particular area. Or if you have an ethnic niche, that's even broader. Well, both of these actually are pretty broad. Think about different organizations associated with that group that you focus on. It could be music or cultural groups. It could be history groups, language-based groups, something else. Think beyond genealogy. I think one of the things that we do as genealogy professionals is that sometimes we focus too much on genealogy, and there are a lot of groups that could partner with us and we could partner with them, even though they're not specifically doing exactly what we're doing. So like Restoration Home, Restoration Man, that wasn't necessarily house histories, but she was able to fit into those shows. How can you fit into some broader organizations that are already out there, and how can you add value to them? So think about how you can expand your reach and your business by partnering with other organizations and showing that expertise that you have and how it contributes to them. So your action item this week is to brainstorm a list of organizations that you could possibly partner with that are just a little bit broader than genealogy. You know, maybe they're cultural organizations, maybe they're history organizations, and think about how you could provide value to them by sharing your expertise. Until next week, so long.